All right, well, let's go ahead and begin. My name is Greg Justice. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer, CEO, and ED of the California Green Academy. We are a domestic 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to promote systems thinking and the triple bottom line in business, energy, and transport. One of our major programs is Transportica, and that's a news source for sustainable transportation. Our motto is mobility meeting the triple bottom line. And we're very proud to inaugurate our new speaker series, the Transformational Speaker Series, which will be a regular monthly webinar focusing on transformational transportation change in both sustainable transportation, urban mobility, innovative mobility, and so forth. And we're very excited for our first speaker today. But before that, we are partnering with Island Press for this speaker series, and we're a very proud partner with Island. They are amazing publishers of sustainability and sustainable transportation publications. So let me first introduce to you Jen Haas. Jen Haas is Island Press's partnership manager. She joined Island Press in 2018 after spending several years building partnerships, doing sales and farming in the food and ag industry. Jen spent most of 2017 traveling through 27 countries in pursuit of adventure and discovery. She has a passion for the environment, resiliency, and finding her next great meal. Please welcome Jen Haas.
Thanks, Greg. And thanks for partnering with us. We're proud partners of working with you as well. So Island Press, for a little background, is a 501c3 charitable organization. We began with a simple idea that knowledge is power, the power to imagine a better future and find ways for getting us there. Island Press was founded in 1984 with the mission to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and create solutions to its complex problems. Our programs include work on climate change impacts and adaptations, sustainable communities, and urban resilience. And we bring authors and their views into conversations with people who can trigger change on the ground and keep it moving forward. While Ethan isn't an Island Press author, we respect his work that he's done at Railtown and other publications. Ethan is the Director of Climate Program for CLEE and leads the Climate Change and Business Research Initiative on behalf of UC Berkeley and UCLA Schools of Law. He taught at the UCLA Law School's Frank Wells Environmental Law Clinic and served as an environmental law research fellow. He has a background in the California Environmental Quality Act, climate change law, and environmental justice, and other environmental law topics. In 2005, he co-founded a Native American nonprofit organization that provides alternative dispute resolution services and support for tribal governance, justice, and in educational institutions. His book on the history of the modern Los Angeles rail system, was published by University of California Press in January 2014. Ethan is also a regular host of the weekly call-in show City Visions on San Francisco's NPR affiliate KALW 91.7, airing on Monday nights at 7 p.m. And Ethan, you can take it away.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Jen, and thank you, Greg, Island Press, and Cal Green for hosting me for this. I'm really excited that you are launching this inaugural series. And Jen, I would love to work with Island Press, so I went with UC Press for the book, but I have a lot of respect for Island Press. So looking forward to going through the history here of LA's transit system and talking a little bit about what the future might bring in terms of mobility and more transit infrastructure going forward, and then definitely want to take any questions, so feel free to use the chat function. I'll try to monitor that as I'm going through the presentation, and I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to, hopefully you can all see this, I'm going to put this slides up that I've prepared for this, so hopefully that's visible. And I'll go through, there's a title slide just so you can have a chance to read it, although Jen already gave the intro. So basically, to start from essentially the beginning, this is a nice artist rendering, really, of what Los Angeles used to look like shortly after Europeans and Asians started arriving in what was previously, for about 10, 12,000 years, a Native American village site. And it was, as you can see, a very pleasant place. It still is today. Climate, as we all know, is very benign. And it's pretty flat terrain, just punctuated by some of these really steep and high elevation mountain ranges that traverse the different parts of the LA basin, basically. So, being such a pleasant place, it attracted a lot of people to move to it, particularly as the railroads opened, Transcontinental Railroad, and the spur was built down to LA in the 1870s. And people from the Midwest, the East Coast in particular, really wanted to come out and kind of live a California dream. Now, this was before the automobile started. And so the main way that people traveled around, first it was horse and buggy, and then it was horse-drawn cars basically on tracks, and then eventually electric streetcars were built. And this is a picture of the Pacific Electric red car system that Collis Huntington, you can see him pictured there in the bottom right, that he basically acquired and operated. And he was a nephew of Henry Huntington, who you may know from the Huntington Gardens, and was one of the big railroad barons that helped get the Transcontinental Railroad built. But this was the main way that people traveled around, was by these streetcars. And given that flat terrain, people could live in these sort of streetcar suburbs and hop on the streetcar and head into work in a place like downtown LA where the jobs were concentrated. But what happened is that as the automobile took over, and I should show you this map here before I talk about that. This is a map of the Pacific Electric streetcar system. So you can see the rail cars went all over the LA basin, and this is a good way to make a modern day Angelino cry to show what was lost in this amazing streetcar system. You could go all the way up to the San Gabriel Mountains, out to the beach. You could really traverse the entire county and into San Bernardino and Riverside counties as well. But then the automobile came about, and that really is what killed this streetcar system. This is a picture of Judge Doom from Who Killed Roger Rabbit, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I should say, the movie in the late 1980s that came out that had this conspiracy theory that in fact it was an evil Judge Doom and General Motors type conspiracy that undid the streetcar system. But in fact, it was the rise of the automobile. When this flat terrain, pleasant climate, the automobile made it really convenient to get around. At the time, we didn't have the same population that we have in LA today. So people really took to the automobile the way they've taken in our lifetimes to smartphones. It was a really similar kind of disruptive technology. And there really was no downside to driving an automobile at the time because, like I say, you didn't have the population. So you didn't have the traffic that we do today. And people were already living in far-flung subdivisions centered around streetcars. So the automobile made it really convenient to connect from these far-flung areas into job centers, retail spots, entertainment centers, etc. So as the automobile adoption rate increased dramatically, and as the population kept increasing, the streetcars really fell out of favor. And there were attempts to revive them through the 1920s, but voters really didn't look at them very favorably. They were looked at as an outdated technology. They were a bit of a monopoly, and people didn't like how they were charging their fares. And as cars became more popular, the streetcars also went slower as they had to share the streets now in many spots with cars, and there were accidents that resulted. So a lot of people did love the streetcars and wanted to save them, but the predominant political drive was really around the automobile. And so they were dismantled all the way through the early 1960s. That was the last streetcar line that went from LA down to Long Beach. And here's a picture of the automobile, the first freeway in America, and the Arroyo Seco freeway there. And you can see how the automobile in the lower picture there was really getting in the way, essentially, of the streetcars. And without flat terrain, it just, all those spokes around the streetcar system, all the residential spokes basically started to fill in. And you got this sort of low-rise sprawl that we now see across the LA basin. So that's the picture of the last streetcars. In 1961, they were all sent off. I think some of them were running down in Central America, I think if I'm remembering that correctly, but a lot of them went to the scrap heap. And the problems kept getting worse with automobile. automobiles through the 50s and 60s. Air quality got terrible. Smog was just really infamous at that point in Los Angeles. Traffic was terrible. Sprawl was chewing up all the open space out into the Imperial Valley, the Inland Empire, and now it's going out into the Imperial Valley. And so when Tom Bradley, who's pictured here, ran for mayor in 1973, he was the first mayoral candidate to make the revival of transit, and rail transit specifically, a cornerstone of his campaign. And he was able to harness all of this voter frustration with the traffic, with the smog, with all the congestion, to really create a political movement promising rail. And he promised that he could basically blanket LA County with a rail transit system that could get started within 18 months. That was his pledge, although he later claimed that he sort of said it accidentally. He didn't mean that it would take 18 months because, as we now know, it takes more like 18 years probably is more realistic than 18 months to get these lines planned and then funded and then actually built. So this was Bradley's mandate when he won in 73 as a mayor of LA City to start a rail program, and he needed to get the funding for it. So his first order of business was to go to the federal government and say, can you provide 80% of the funding for a rail system? Because that was the deal they were offering cities at the time. And then he would try to marshal 20% of the sources locally. And he was basically able to get that package put together through some state gas tax dollars. But he also needed to try to raise local dollars. And he put forth a sales tax measure in 1974, the November election, actually I think it was June of 74. Sorry about that. Not that it matters that much, but basically shortly after his first year in office. And it was a half-cent sales tax measure to fund rail, basically a really comprehensive rail network. But it went down to defeat. The voters rejected it. It had a lot of support within LA City, and you can see the red here is LA City that Mayor Bradley represented. But look how big LA County is. It's a really huge county. I mean, you can fit Delaware and Rhode Island both in LA County. And it has a gross domestic product bigger than something like 43 US states. I mean, it's a huge county. And so while he got a lot of support within LA City, all these far-flung areas around the county, voters up in Palmdale, for example, or even down in the South Bay and out east, just didn't see anything in it for them. And so it went down to defeat, and that was a big setback for him. And so throughout the 70s, he kept trying, but the federal government basically felt like LA itself doesn't have a consensus on rail. We don't really want to step in with dollars. But in 1980, LA County Supervisor Kenneth Hahn, who's pictured here, tried to make another go of it. And he said, let's try another sales tax measure, but let's make it more modest in scope. And let's have a bunch of this money that would be raised go to local governments for any of their transportation needs. Let's have a chunk that would go to reducing bus fares for 5 years or freezing them at 25 cents. And then let's have another chunk for rail of some sort. And in November 1980, as the country was electing Ronald Reagan, LA voters actually approved this measure with 54% approval. Now, since then, the legal voter hurdle is now 2/3. So it would not have passed today at 54%. But at the time, because of Prop 13, and Prop 13 did not apply to these local voter initiatives, as the California Supreme Court eventually held, 54% was sufficient. So it did pass, and they promised, as you can see in this map, another comprehensive rail system. So ironically, Mayor Bradley didn't want any part of this 1980 sales tax measure. He didn't really campaign for it. His delegate to the Transportation Commission actually voted against putting it on the ballot, and then when that was a deciding vote against it, this is Ray Remy, his appointee, actually ended up switching his vote according to the mayor's instructions not to be a deciding vote against it. But Mayor Bradley thought this was going to go down to defeat. And Kenny Hahn really had a shoestring budget to get this passed. He had something like $35,000 in campaign funds and was out campaigning on highway off-ramps to try to, saying how this was going to relieve congestion in Los Angeles. But it did pass. And then there was a debate about where to put rail with this new influx of local sales tax dollars. Now, it should have gone first down the Wilshire Corridor. And this is a picture of the Wilshire Corridor. And you can see what stands out here about Wilshire is the density. And when you have density like this, when you have these high-rise condominiums along Wilshire past Westwood. You could see Miracle Mile all the way down to downtown Los Angeles. Just follow the tall buildings. The Century Cities over there are kind of dead ahead. That's where you get the ridership when you have high density buildings clustered around rail transit. So this would have been the logical place to start. But because Kenny Hahn had gotten the money and represented the corridor from Long Beach to downtown LA, and that was also, somewhat ironically, the last Pacific Electric corridor in 1961, Kenny Hahn basically got the spoils of his sales tax measure. And so the LA Transportation Commission voted to basically make this the first light rail line in LA. And so they selected it in 1982 to be under construction to link downtown LA to downtown Long Beach, the two biggest cities in LA County. And it was thought that this line could open very quickly. Kenny Hahn wanted it open in time for the 1984 Olympics, which LA was set to host. Ended up not being opened until 1990. But that was the hope. And it reflected a lot of sort of naivete, I guess you could say, or inexperience with building modern rail. LA didn't have any experience building any new rail system in a half century at that point. San Francisco had experience with the BART line, but in Atlanta was building its MARTA system, and Washington, D.C. had built its metro. But LA was kind of new to the game. A light rail line like this was fairly new in the country as well. So they were really overly optimistic about how quickly they could get this thing built and how cheap they could do it. But ultimately, it's now essentially the highest ridership light rail line in the country, depending on how you figure it. So it's been successful, and it's a jammed light rail line, basically kind of end-to-end commuter line, although the middle stations are mostly underdeveloped around them and still have a lot of low-rise residential communities that are very sort of industrial and not very high rent areas. So we haven't seen a lot of development within the line yet, but definitely let's revitalize Long Beach and help contribute to downtown LA's resurgence, along with a lot of investment in things like LA Live and the Staples Center and all the condos going in downtown. And then the question was where to put the second rail line, and the LA's transit leaders' hands were a little bit forced here because there was a new freeway going in, the Century Freeway. And by court decree, by settlement, there was going to be a transit line in the middle of the freeway. It could have been a busway, which in retrospect would have made a lot more sense. But the LA transit leaders felt like, hey, this is a great opportunity to get rail built quickly, cheaply. It's right in the median. It's ready to go. And we can link employees from the eastern part of the county into the then burgeoning aerospace industry near LAX. And this was before, during the Cold War, before the Cold War ended, when we had a lot of Cold War type defense investment in that aerospace industry. Unfortunately, by the time the Green Line opened, Cold War was over. LA was in a terrible recession. The aerospace industry had collapsed. So the light rail line really failed to meet projections, ridership projections. And because it travels in the middle of the freeway, the stations are not conducive to encouraging any transit-oriented development, because we really don't want to put a lot of development right next to a freeway where the air quality is bad and it's not an easy place to walk to. So the stations are very sort of hostile for pedestrians to be right in the middle of the freeway. So while it was built cheaply, between a combination of bad luck and sort of poor foresight, it's not been a very successful station. Should have been, I think, a busway, which would have been a lot cheaper to build and would have saved the LA transit agencies a lot of money to have to keep operating expensive rail systems. And then meanwhile, Tom Bradley was not giving up on what he wanted to build, which was a subway, a heavy rail subway. Heavy rail meaning you get power from down below, and it's more expensive, but you can fit more people on it. And he wanted to build it sort of out Wilshire Boulevard, which is where the density was. But then for political reasons, he needed to have it go up into Hollywood because there was a state senator, Dave Roberti, who was basically putting the restrictions on state funds unless it served his district in Hollywood. And then it needed to go up to the San Fernando Valley for political reasons too, to kind of give the constituents of the San Fernando Valley a sense of a stake in what would be a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project for LA. Now, ridership-wise, it should have just kept going straight down Wilshire, but there was this desire to just try to get as much of Wilshire as possible, but then also serve these two politically important areas of downtown Hollywood and up into the San Fernando Valley. But then an explosion happened on Fairfax in Hollywood because of a methane gas pocket. And people who were opposed to the subway going up Fairfax before it sort of dogtailed back into Hollywood used this explosion as an excuse to halt the subway going up Fairfax, because they said, we're not going to tunnel a subway through a methane gas rich, area. This is a recipe for further disaster. So Henry Waxman, who was congressman at the time, was able, because he was sympathetic to stopping the subway, he wanted to protect his Fairfax constituents from gentrification, essentially, that he feared would result from building the subway there. He basically put the kibosh on any federal funds for a subway extension up Fairfax. And Zev Yaroslavsky, who represented that area in the city council, and Dave Roberti, again in the state senate, all kind of teamed up to prevent the subway from going up Fairfax, which meant they had to reroute it. Instead of it going far down Wilshire to Fairfax, they were now going to have it go out as far as they could on Wilshire to Western Avenue and then go up Vermont. And they came to this compromise with federal representative Julian Dixon, who represented the district just to the south. And he was fine with the subway coming through his area. So he basically negotiated a compromise with Henry Waxman. Look, it won't go along Wilshire, it'll come down Pico into my district, and then we'll send it up Vermont, steering clear of your district, which in the long run may not be the worst thing, because a connection from downtown LA up Vermont into Hollywood is a more direct way to connect downtown Hollywood to downtown LA. It would have been a longer connection, but for about a generation or more, it's prevented service from that whole section of Wilshire down to Fairfax and from having a heavy rail transit, which it really needed. So I think Waxman and his colleagues Yaroslavsky and Roberti did a disservice by preventing the subway from going farther down Wilshire, and it's going to end up costing LA taxpayers a lot more money, because it was cheaper to have built it back in the 80s and 90s than it will be now, and it's now under construction finally, which I'll talk about. But that was a missed opportunity for a generation or more to get that built where it should have been built down Wilshire Boulevard. But so with that compromise, they were finally able to get the federal funding, and the groundbreaking for the subway started in 1986, or occurred in 1986, and they only had money to do a 4-mile segment that was going to cost, I think, over $1 billion. So it was kind of a gamble. We're just going to get this 4 miles built underneath downtown LA, and let's hope we can get the funding for the rest of it. But I think history shows that that's the most important thing. Just get the system started. You can always go back and get dollars basically as you need it from the voters, from federal government. And so that ended up working out. Meanwhile, the light rail lines, as I said, were under construction, and you can see I've got them listed out here. So the blue line, the Long Beach line, opened finally in 1990, 22 miles and $877 million to build that. The red line subway, as I mentioned, 4.4 miles, that opened in 1993 and at a cost of $1 billion. And then the green line down the Century Freeway ended up costing $718 million. It was definitely a lot cheaper at 20 miles because it was built in the middle of the freeway. And that opened up in 1995. So that was sort of the initial burst of projects under the Prop A that passed in 1980, the sales tax measure. But then 1990, they wanted to keep building projects. And so Neil Peterson, who at this point was the executive director of LA County's Transportation Commission, wanted to go back with a new proposition, half sales tax measure, Prop C, promising a subway that would go out to West LA and East LA and then up into North Hollywood, basically finishing that link up through Hollywood into the valley. He wanted to build the Expo line, which was along basically an old Santa Monica Pacific Electric airline route along Interstate 10, basically, Santa Monica Freeway, and along Exposition Boulevard. And that would connect eventually Santa Monica Beach to downtown LA. And it was an old freight rail that they could now convert to light rail. He wanted to build a green line extension up to LAX, and then also an extension from downtown LA out to Pasadena, which had a lot of political support. And that would also follow a freight rail line out that way, but had a lot of political support, particularly from a Republican in Congress, David Dreyer, who represented a district farther east, but wanted to see light rail get to Pasadena and then eventually out to his district. And so having that bipartisan support in Congress made that a really politically powerful line. And then this Prop C barely passed, whereas Prop A had passed with 54%. In 1990, Prop C passed with 50.4%. So it just barely passed, but it got another half cent of sales tax dedicated towards rail, although other sources of transportation as well. Similar to Prop A, it had money for buses, money for local governments, so it wasn't just for rail. And then with those dollars in place, the Red Line was able to open up to North Hollywood in 2000. So that made for an 18.6 mile heavy rail subway line, $4.7 billion in cost. And then the Pasadena line eventually opened, even though there was a lot of controversy over it because it didn't really have the same ridership projections as Expo Line, for example, had. But the political forces behind it, and actually Adam Schiff, who now is congressman and has made his name for himself investigating the Trump administration, he was a state representative at the time and helped get this built because he represented Pasadena. And so that opened with 13.7 miles and $900 million in cost. But there had been a lot of controversy in the meantime. There was a lawsuit over the Red Line subway and the spending practices of the LA Metro, as it was now called in the 90s, and low-income communities of color and their advocates felt that the spending on rail was racist, essentially, and violating civil rights because it was predominantly benefiting professional workers at the expense of low-income bus riders, as Metro was spending more and more dollars on rail and raising fares, meanwhile, on the bus system. So there was a lawsuit that ended up in a settlement, which between that and another 1998 sales tax measure sponsored by Zev Yaroslavsky that froze any new sales tax money from going to rail. So there's a whole sort of anti-rail sentiment in the 90s. That prevented really much from happening on the rail front, except for these projects which were underway and moving forward. But as they had to deal with this challenge of not being able to spend as much money on rail, I think a good thing happened, which is that LA Metro looked for low-cost transit alternatives as a response. And one of the big things was looking at what's called bus rapid transit. And this was very appropriate for a corridor that's now the Orange Line in the San Fernando Valley. And the idea was, and this was a Zev Yaroslavsky project, where he and other transit leaders flew to Brazil and saw bus rapid transit in action. And it's basically like rubber tires instead of rail, but a rail car with rubber tires, where you have stops that are pretty spaced apart. You have frequent bus service, and ideally a separate right-of-way. You really need that separate right-of-way. So in the San Fernando Valley, you have an old rail corridor that they essentially just paved over and able to run buses at relatively high speeds on it. But this was a much lower cost way to get rail-type benefits. So you can see 14 miles, $330 million to build it. So a fraction of what that would have cost if it had been light rail. And it got built in a far less time than it would have taken if it had been rail. And then there was a 4-mile extension that opened in 2012. But I think this is a really powerful model for LA for areas that are not as high density. Bus rapid transit is a very inexpensive way and a much quicker way to get high quality transit built. It doesn't have the acceleration benefits of light rail, although as buses become electric, battery electric in particular, I think that difference will go away. And the buses are also it's much more flexible to operate them. And I think with autonomous vehicle technology, we can probably start seeing some interesting things with bus rapid transit, where you can have essentially autonomous buses that are electric. So you have the same effect as a electric rail that are platooning, meaning that they're basically connected through computers and through software and able to accelerate and decelerate in tandem. So they'll actually look like trains, but they'll all be on rubber tires, they'll all be electric, and they'll be very inexpensive to operate compared to rail. So I think that is a very promising technology to integrate autonomous vehicles into high-capacity busways. The critical thing is to make sure the region sets aside a dedicated right-of-way like it has with the Orange Line, which is a somewhat unique kind of feature because it was an old rail line, but you can still do dedicated bus lines on the freeway. You can do dedicated busways on major arterials. So this is a really, I think, a very promising solution for LA's transit and mobility challenges. But then in 2008, there was a renewed interest in getting rail going again. There had been the setbacks in the 90s, but the voters were really kind of changing their attitudes about rail and mobility. There were demographic changes, more Latinos in particular in LA, who were much more pro-transit generally, younger people, millennials, who wanted to be able to get around without vehicles, that having to be reliant on automobiles. So Villaraigosa really captured this and went back to the voters in 2008 with Measure R, half-cent sales tax measure, and the group Move LA was a big driver for this measure as well. And the basic idea was another kind of Prop A, Prop C type approach, money for rail, money for bus system, money for local governments to improve mobility. And now they needed to clear a 2/3 hurdle. But in the midst of a very big recession in 2008, as Wall Street was collapsing and as Obama was getting elected president, it did pass just barely with a 2/3 approval rate among LA County voters. So there was a whole shot in the arm revenue-wise of dollars for rail now in LA going forward. And with that, rail is starting to open and be underway with some major new lines. So the East Side Gold Line, this was basically an extension that would have been heavy rail subway, but it goes out to the east side of LA. But with the 1998 sales tax measure, or anti-sales tax measure that prevented any new sales tax dollars from going to heavy rail, that Xavier Sofsky was behind, that I mentioned a few minutes ago, that now became a cheaper light rail line. That opened in 2009, 6 miles, almost 900 million. Meanwhile, the Gold Line had a lot of political support to extend it out to David Dreyer's district. So it extended to Azusa, opening in 2016. And that is kind of like the Green Line now. That's going out in the median of the freeway. It's a low density area and not really appropriate for light rail, which is very expensive, 11.5 miles, 735 million. Whole extension past Pasadena really should just be a busway down the median of the freeway. It doesn't have very high ridership. It's a real kind of waste of money, and it would have been built a lot faster and more cheaply, be less expensive to operate if it was bus. So that's an example where we end up spending a lot of money on gold-plated rail lines for low-density areas that can't justify it based on the ridership. But the opposite story of that is the Expo line, which really does merit light rail because of the density of jobs and people that live along the line. And so there were groups like Friends for Expo that really helped agitate for this line. And finally, with the Measure R dollars in particular, that helped ensure that it would be rail the whole way out. And so the first line opened in 2012 to Culver City, the first section of it, 8.6 miles, 930 million. More expensive to build in a more densely populated area, but ultimately worthwhile, I think. And then the remaining last segment opened to Santa Monica in 2016 for $1.5 billion. And this has been a very successful line. And it really shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. There are a lot of people who live in Santa Monica, work in Santa Monica and downtown LA and Culver City as well in the middle. And it's not a big secret how you have a successful rail line. You have to just build it where the people are and where the jobs are. And that's exactly what happened with Expo. So I think that is a real kind of feather in the cap for LA Metro and a long overdue line that should have been built, I think before Long Beach, certainly before the Green Line, definitely before the Pasadena line. But it had to wait its turn, and now it's finally open to a lot of success. And now under construction, we have the Purple Line subway, which is basically the Wilshire subway that should have been built, right off the bat. And that is under construction, 9 miles out to the VA for $8.2 billion. So it's almost $1 billion a mile, which speaks to how out of control our tunneling costs have gotten. But it's also just an expensive place to tunnel. It's very expensive real estate. Very densely populated area, so it's a more complicated project. And this is kind of a funny segment here. There's three chunks of it, one of which is underway right now, the La Cienega extension from Western out to La Cienega. That's going to be a really important connection there. That's going to open in 2023. And then the Culver City connection is actually right now slated to open after the final section. It's kind of confusing, but the last section, the third section of after the VA is supposed to open 2024. The Culver City section is based on the kind of quirks of how it's been funded, is going to open in 2026. I think they'll smooth that out, but that's just kind of an odd situation we have now. But eventually that'll be a very, very well-utilized subway line. I think one of the most it's going to be one of the most successful transit lines in the country. This is Wilshire Corridor in general is the most densely populated corridor west of the Mississippi. So this is going to be very well used. In fact, it may be unpleasantly crowded in there because they can only accommodate 6-car trains at this point. And then meanwhile, the Crenshaw line is under construction, which connects basically the Expo Crenshaw station, you can see here on this map, down to the Green Line right by the airport. So there's going to be a people mover connection from the airport out to connect the Crenshaw line. So that'll provide a nice north-south connection, kind of parallel to the Long Beach line, and then connect the blue line down to the green line. And eventually they want to extend Crenshaw up to the purple line. And there's discussion now about where the best place to connect it might be. And then the regional connector, because you have heavy rail coming into downtown LA, and then you have the light rail blue line to Long Beach, or to the Union Station, there's no one-seat ride basically from Pasadena down to Long Beach. You have to switch at Union Station to heavy rail and then back to light rail to the Long Beach line, or to Expo if you wanted to go out there. So the regional connector will provide another rail connection through downtown LA and make it a one-seat ride from Pasadena out to Santa Monica or down to Long Beach. And it's a very expensive connection, 1.9 miles, $1.7 billion, slated to open in 2021. But that is just the nature of trying to tunnel under downtown LA. But also, again, an example of how much costs have really inflated for these construction projects. And then meanwhile, the Gold Line folly continues, and there's funding now to get it out to Montclair, 12.3 miles, opening in 2020 for $1.5 billion. Again, this should have been a busway. That area is too low density to justify the expense, both capital expense and operating expense of rail out there. Should have been a busway, and that's an unfortunate waste of money, but sort of the political cost of getting these sales tax measures approved. Because to get that 2/3 hurdle, you basically have to tell everyone all across LA County you're going to get a rail line at some point in order to get them to support the sales tax measures. And then another big sales tax measure happened in 2016, and Mayor Eric Garcetti was really out in front of this. This is Measure M. And this has, between this and Measure R, I mean, there is just hundreds of billions now available. There's 40 billion under Measure R, now 120 billion under Measure M for transit. So these are major investments. This passed another 2/3. This actually got over 70% approval in LA County. And some of the big projects now that are under discussion here, well, a big one would be connecting Sepulveda Pass with rail, basically. And you can see that number 6 there. And that they're under discussion right now what they want to do, but it would connect basically the purple line and the VA out to the valley, and might be a public-private partnership, or maybe a public entity might build it and then hand it over to a private entity to operate it, in which case they may do a tunnel under the Santa Monica Mountains there, and maybe have rail as part of the tunnel and also a toll road as part of the tunnel. They may try some different kind of rail alignments, bus rapid transit. There's a bit of a challenge if they go on the surface because it's a very steep grade, so not very suitable for heavy rail, as I understand, but they're figuring out what to do. And that would really be a major connection there between the valley and the west side, and that part of the valley has a lot of jobs in the Sherman Oaks area, a lot of density as well. So that's an appropriate part of the valley to try to connect into the west side rail network. Another big transit corridor that's under discussion is the Vermont Avenue corridor, south of where it goes now on the Red Line subway. That is one of the most populous, high ridership bus lines in the county. And the question is, does it deserve rail? Does it deserve some kind of bus rapid transit line? There's a lot of controversy over that. It seems like given the ridership, rail is appropriate down Vermont, but if they go with a bus rapid transit route, it really needs to be a high-speed bus network with a dedicated right-of-way. And then in addition, there's a connection in the San Fernando Valley down to the Orange Line up to the Metrolink stop in San Fernando. And that's, I believe the Metro has approved a light rail extension there. So with the Measure M dollars, there's a whole lot of new talk now about where to put new rail projects. The challenge will be right-sizing the project so they don't run out of money too quickly, because that's pretty much what's happened. That there's big plans with these new sales tax measures, but they end up costing so much money that there's not enough dollars to fund all the projects that they want to fund. And so the region really needs to focus on right-sizing the projects, not overspending, doing more bus rapid transit, and not some of these real big shiny rail infrastructure projects that simply don't have the ridership to justify it. Because once you lack the ridership, that means the region has to subsidize these rail lines even more, and then the operating subsidies really cannibalize the transit budget overall. So a few lessons learned in terms of my study of the rail history in LA and my involvement in land use policies more generally in California. The first is you should never build a high quality transit line without requiring density along the route. Too often they would build these rail lines in relatively low density areas, and the rail planners all thought, oh, well, the market will just sort of drive a lot of new high-rise development around the stations. But that never happens. Usually the opposite, in fact, happens, where a rail line comes in and a local government with the zoning authority over the land will start down zoning to prevent new development from happening, because local neighbors don't want to see more traffic and parking challenges and all the rest. And so what happens is you get these low density areas that are not able to generate ridership to support the rail system. So a lot of LA's rail lines have essentially been wasted investments because they haven't spurred the density of jobs and residential development that we need. And so I don't believe any transit agency should be spending money on something like rail infrastructure without a requirement of rezoning around the station areas, allowing greater heights and density, eliminating parking requirements. That's the best way to get the most out of the investment. And it's just not a real complicated thing. I mean, you see the successful rail systems all around the country, New York City, Washington, D.C., look around the world, Paris, London. The reason why these are high ridership systems is because of the built environment around them. And that means high density of jobs and residences. So, and there's demand for this. I mean, LA is experiencing a huge housing shortage, particularly in the job-rich west side of LA. And a lot of these people would love to not have to drive everywhere. So build those new homes around the rail, make that easy for people to take advantage of the rail network. That's the number one requirement. And there was a state bill proposed this year, SB 827, that actually would have made it mandatory to upzone around a half-mile around a major transit stop. That went down pretty quickly, but the bill author, Scott Wiener in San Francisco, is going to bring that back. So I think if states and regions, if locals and regions can't figure this out and can't do better with their local land use policies around rail transit, the state is going to have to intervene. And then we need more low-cost transit options, as I mentioned, more bus rights of way. To really right-size transit for more lower density areas, and also to just save the money, because we don't want to keep wasting a lot of these dollars on high capital infrastructure projects. And then the last point I'd make is that we just need to streamline the planning and construction of these systems in general. It just costs too much money to do this tunneling. It's way out of whack compared to what other developed countries are spending on tunneling. So we need to figure out some way of better management. Maybe there's ways to ensure that there's better oversight of these construction contracts. A lot of allegations of corruption where contractors are spending a lot of money on campaign contributions of the same people who then turn around and give them contracts to build these expensive projects. So we need to streamline the construction, but we also need to streamline the planning. It takes too long to plan these rail lines. So all that just comes out of public dollars. The more you delay, the more money we waste, and the more we're spending in these expensive construction contracts. And it's not just a problem in LA. This is a problem throughout California, really throughout the US, as we saw with the Second Avenue subway cost overruns in New York City, as an example. And some just mobility themes along the lines of this webinar here, what to kind of think about going forward. So support for transit and walkability in LA and really around the country is definitely growing. And that's reflected in those sales tax votes. The idea that we went from 54% in 1980 to 50% approval in 1990, up to 67% in 2008, and then 70% in 2016 for these sales tax measures indicates real widespread voter support for more transit in LA. And also for walkability, to have neighborhoods, homes that are very conveniently located that don't require an automobile. So we should be building as much as possible to accommodate this growing segment of the market, because the environmental benefits of this are huge for everyone else. If people want to live without a car, that's great. That means it means a lot less air pollution. That means less traffic. That means less pressure on our open space and farmland from getting developed. So you won't need to live up in Newhall Ranch, for example, or out into even close to Bakersfield and Tejon Ranch, and then commute into jobs. You have more access for people who want affordable homes in the job-rich existing urbanized areas. So we should be supporting that as much as possible. But we also need to take into account these technology changes that we're seeing, particularly autonomous vehicles. Now, I'm not one of those people who says we shouldn't build any more transit because AVs, autonomous vehicles, are basically going to take over. I think autonomy can be used, particularly on these busways. I could imagine, for example, at some point, and this is kind of a radical concept to think about, but we could even potentially pave over our existing rail lines and run battery-powered buses, autonomous buses, that could carry the same number of people as a heavy rail train car system could. I mean, you could have 10 buses, electric buses, all platooning, stacked up against each other, running at the same speeds as rail, and for the rider experience, there would be no difference. I mean, you wouldn't be able to tell. It would be smooth, it wouldn't be in traffic, it would have the same acceleration as an electric train, and you could save so much money if you did that. I mean, all the electrical infrastructure that we now have for rail, you wouldn't need that. The buses would be much cheaper to buy than these really expensive rail cars, and it could all be operated through computer software. So I think that kind of autonomy is very, very enticing, and similarly, like I say, for busways through the streets. But there's question marks around the AV technology and how quickly it's developing. So I don't think there's any reason to, as an excuse, to not do transit. But it's really about the infrastructure and the right-of-way, setting up that separate from automobiles. But also these transportation network companies, these Ubers and Lyfts that we're seeing, they've had a major impact, I think, on ridership, which we've seen decrease. But as people get used to shared mobility, I think that's going to change how we think about transit, because it may be that we can, and we're starting to do this already, but really take advantage of Ubers and Lyfts as a last mile solution to get people who are farther away from a transit stop access to major transit. But then telecommuting too, we're seeing different travel patterns. People can work from home more. And then of course I hear a lot of questions around Hyperloop and the Elon Musk's Boring Company. And my feeling is these are very sort of pie in the sky kinds of approaches that may be successful. Hyperloop could be successful. These tubes or people travel like currently these, you can put those mail tubes basically, and frictionless vacuums. People could travel 700-800 miles an hour. My feeling is right now it's all private investment in the Boring Company and Hyperloop. Let's let them pay for it, see if it works. If it works, they can demonstrate it. Maybe that's something that the public sector should consider as well. But in the meantime, I don't think there's much need to put things on hold for these sort of more futuristic technologies. And then, as I mentioned, we've seen transit ridership decrease all across the country. No one's exactly clear why, but there was an interesting study that folks at UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies did, Brian Taylor and his colleagues there, showing that most of the ridership decrease has actually been concentrated in a few high ridership areas that used to ride the bus a lot. And what they've seen is demographic changes, that basically these used to be very low income areas, primarily communities of color, where people are highly dependent on the bus network. And for whatever reason, through demographic change, most likely, new people have moved in who don't need to ride the bus as much. And I've just noticed demographically, you've seen lower income people, working class people, communities of color moving into far-flung, more affordable parts of LA. They're getting out of the sort of urban core of LA. It's happening in the San Francisco Bay Area too, and being replaced through gentrification, essentially, by more affluent people who don't need to ride transit as much. But certainly Ubers and Lyfts are cutting into transit to some extent, and the economic growth has made people have more income to be able to buy cars. So we're seeing vehicle miles traveled increasing. That's sort of taking over where transit used to be. So this is something we need to figure out. And it could be short term if gas prices increase, if the economy were to decrease at some point. Some of it may be tied to immigration as well, because a lot of those low income bus riders were recent arrivals. And now with immigration essentially down to zero in the US, we've lost that sort of pipeline of transit riders. So a lot of different factors could be at play here. But I think the bottom line is if you still have a neighborhood of density for jobs and residents, and you connect them with fast transit to job centers, that will always be a successful transit line if it can outcompete the automobile through that dedicated right-of-way. So that should really be the focus going forward. So here's a map for my book, Railtown, on the rail system, at least as of publication date back in 2014. So you can see what LA has basically done transit-wise, rail transit-wise. And this is what my book looks like if you're interested in purchasing a copy. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions, and I also encourage you to check out my blog. You can sign up for subscriptions on ethanelkind.com, and of course you can follow me on Twitter as well. So let me see if there's any questions coming in, and with that, I will be happy to entertain questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. I learned a lot, and I know our attendees did as well. And to jump off the Q&A, we have a trivia question. And with this trivia question, if you get it right, you will win a book. You'll win the Railtown book. So send me a private message on the chat for your answer. And the question is, today, July 26th, is the 15th anniversary of which LA Metro rail line? I think if you were paying close attention, you might have heard that in the presentation. So feel free to send me your answer to that. And if anyone has questions, please do shoot them off now.
Well, I see some questions here. I'm happy. Well, first of all, Daryl Clark, who's listening in, who's very involved in Friends for Expo, had some important corrections. So I want to just note them. I appreciate that, Daryl. But yeah, Collis Huntington was one of the big four owners in the Southern Pacific, and it was his nephew Henry Huntington that owned the Pacific Electric. So I got those backwards. And then I think I also must have noted Century's. It's Culver City on the Purple Line slide, and it's really Century City that the Purple Line is going to connect to. And then he also points out, Daryl is well steeped in rail history as well, that in LA, that right now the Sepulveda Pass corridor options are all rail and no longer including the toll lanes. So those are all important corrections, Daryl. Thank you for that. Just want to know that. And happy to take any other questions, if there are any.
Yeah, this is Greg. I wanted to, I have a couple of questions, but I'll go down to one. So part of the reason why we wanted you as this first speaker is not just because Railtown is an amazing book. There really is no other book that's had the history of modern rail, but also tied together the historical aspect of transit in Los Angeles. And one of the things we want to look at, we are a statewide nonprofit, so we want to look at where's the biggest transformation in transit and transportation occurred, and it really has been in Los Angeles. A transit rider in 1990, if they left the region and came back today, would not recognize the transportation infrastructure. So my question to you in particular, do you think this transformation occurred kind of naturally, or do you think it was really kind of the result of the historic federal lawsuit?
So I think there was a lot of local leadership that made this transition happen. I mean, Mayor Bradley in particular, Supervisor Hahn, I mean, they really had the foresight to want to push for rail. And of course, they were responding to changes in voter sentiment. As I mentioned, at the beginning of the 20th century, voters were happy to embrace the automobile, but by the end of the 20th century, or really by the 70s, they were getting frustrated with that technology and its limits. And that is we've just seen that intensify. So I think you have to give a lot of credit to local leaders. You have to give a lot of credit to the electorate, basically, for supporting these changes. And it's something that we're seeing nationwide as well. It's sort of a resurgence of rail. So it's not just LA, but the interesting thing about LA, I think the lessons that it holds for the rest of the country, and particularly other Western cities, is how you go from a city that really was developed around the automobile in so many ways to one that is now more rail oriented. Because we see other cities like Las Vegas now, Phoenix, Salt Lake City embracing rail, but in a sort of modern post-automobile context. And I think the real challenge for LA, they certainly demonstrated that there's political will to build modern rail in a car-oriented city. They've shown that it can be done and presented that model. But what they have not yet shown is how you can essentially redevelop the city around this rail network. I mean, we've seen growth around downtown Long Beach, downtown Hollywood's really revitalized, downtown LA has become a real residential center, and Santa Monica. Those areas have all taken advantage of the rail connections. But it took smart land use policies to make that happen. It didn't happen just because of rail. It happened because local governments in the area, city council representatives, et cetera, changed the zoning code, tried to attract investment in those areas. And so that's going to be the challenge for LA going forward. And I think also for places like Phoenix and Vegas and Salt Lake City and anywhere else that wants to really retrofit their city in a more walkable, more convenient way that's not as dependent on the automobile. I mean, the automobile is always going to be part of LA. The way it's developed, people are going to be dependent on it in many parts of the county. But why not accommodate growth in a more sustainable manner around the existing rail network and provide that option for people? That's where all new growth in Los Angeles should be concentrated, around this very expensive, but now increasingly much more functional rail network. And that's the most sustainable, most economically beneficial and quality of life beneficial way to accommodate new growth.
Are there any other questions? So in the meantime, I have one as well. You mentioned about ridership being, I don't want to say abysmal, but less than admirable on the Gold Line east of Pasadena. With Pomona and Montclair being major transit hubs, do you see that changing when the Gold Line's built out there?
The only thing I think that will change that is if the area where the Gold Line now serves really commits to high density around the transit stops. Otherwise, I just don't see it generating a lot of ridership. It's going to be very much a park and ride, low density kind of environment, big parking lots, parking garages, and that's just not a good way to have thriving communities taking advantage of this rail network. And to make it even worse, Metrolink already goes out there, so in a way, it's duplicating a much better Metrolink service. So I think the only way to really sort of salvage that investment in rail is to really encourage those communities to put more high density development in around the rail stop. What I've seen so far, what they consider high density, is really not very high density. And maybe the market can't support it, but they need to do what they can, because otherwise that's an unfortunate investment.
And this is going to be the last question for me. It looks like with the transformation of the rail system and so forth, what do you think is going to be the greatest lesson LA can take away with? And it sounds like you've mentioned about the rezoning aspect.
Definitely on the density piece of it, but I think the greatest lesson is just better oversight over how the dollars are spent. Again, just inflated construction costs, very long planning processes. They need to do a better job on both of those fronts. But like I said, I think the real lesson, just to end on the positive too, is how rail can be a really incredible tool for revitalizing areas. And those neighborhoods that I mentioned, from Koreatown to Hollywood, downtown, Long Beach, they're all examples of rail done right when you have supportive land use policies. So I think now we finally have a lot of neighborhoods in LA where people can live pretty conveniently without a car, because they can access this rail network and they can take advantage of the Uber and Lyft type of way to get around. But there are other low-cost options too. I mean, bikeways are a great solution for LA, given the flat terrain and the pleasant climate. They can invest a lot in really safe bike infrastructure. Super cheap to do, great way to get people out of their cars and really connect neighborhoods well. So land use is just critical for all of this.
All right, well, we haven't had any other questions come in. On that note, I want to throw it over to Jen real quick.
All right, and we have a winner, and the winner is Daryl Clark. Good job. You remembered actually being there for the opening. So great memory, and you will be getting a book of Railtown.
I was actually there as well, and it was funny because I went to this is Greg. I went to the Sierra Madre Villa station because I lived in Pasadena at the time, and it was a 4-hour wait. So then I zipped by 4 other stations, the Memorial Park station, which is kind of in downtown Pasadena, and it was a 30-minute wait. So I remember that day. It was crazy, but it was exciting. All right. Well, we thank you so much for everyone that's attended. We thank you especially, Ethan Elkind, for taking the time out. We know you're transmitting to us from DC. We appreciate that. And we want to let everyone know, if you go to our website, calgreenacademy.org/transformational, Later today, we'll have the recording up, the slides and so forth. Thank you again, and also thank you to Jen Haas and Island Press for their partnerships. We always enjoy the leadership that Island Press takes with sustainability and sustainable transportation publications. Jen, did you have anything else to add?
Nope, just thanks for having us participate, and I'm sure everyone learned a lot. I did, and everyone have a great day.
All right, thank you so much.
Thanks.